but there is much to do. There is always so very much to do, and there is so much for us to learn. And so I'm so very glad to welcome, as a part and in support of the UIA Progressive Appeal, Amir Tibon to join us this evening.
Thank you. תודה רבה, ברוכים הנמצאים. It's wonderful to join you. Thank you, Rabbi, for this very nice introduction and all the kind words. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for this event in different parts of Australia. For me, this is a very exciting opportunity to speak to you. We are meeting today as Israel is 8 days away from an election. And maybe in the past, this would have sounded a little more exciting because in the past, elections in Israel were more of a rare occasion every 3, maybe 4 years. But now we're at a place where this is the 4th election in 40 months. If you look at the history of Israeli government in the last several decades, the ultra-Orthodox, they went with Shamir from Likud and then with Rabin from Labor. They went with Netanyahu in his first term and then with Ehud Barak, who replaced him. They went with Sharon and with Olmert and then again with Netanyahu. Right wing, left wing, center, Likud, Labor, Kadima, it never mattered to the ultra-Orthodox. They could go with anyone as long as they got what they wanted with the budgets, the military service exemption, and the control over religious issues. But in the last year and a half, something changed. But there is something deeper here. There is something ideological here. When Benny Gantz said that he will give the ultra-Orthodox a blank paper and they will fill it with all their demands and he will sign it, he was honest when it comes to budget and when it comes to religious legislation. But there was one thing that the ultra-Orthodox parties have been dreaming about for decades, and that they know Benny Gantz will never give them. That if they had put that on their list of demands, Gantz would have erased his own signature. And that is weakening the Israeli Supreme Court. And when I say that this election right now that we'll have in 8 days is not an election about nothing or an election about Netanyahu only, but rather an election about everything, this is what I'm referring to. The reason that the ultra-Orthodox parties have decided to stick with Netanyahu throughout this turmoil and go to another and another and another election cycle rather than switch sides is because Netanyahu is promising the ultra-Orthodox something that no other candidate for prime minister in Israel has ever offered before and hopefully will ever offer in the future. And that is to pass a law in the Knesset that would basically allow the smallest possible Knesset majority, 61 seats, to overrule decisions by the Supreme Court. For the ultra-Orthodox parties, this is Chalom Adorot, the dream of generations. Because for many, many years, they have viewed the Supreme Court here in Israel as their most dangerous rival. The Supreme Court has been responsible for a lot of the things that have happened in Israel in recent decades that I personally am the most proud of and that I believe many of you are proud of as well, many of Israel's supporters around the world, not just in Australia. When we talk about how the Israeli military was among the first in the world to allow women to become fighter pilots and to allow members of the military to come out as gay. When we talk about how Tel Aviv has become the most gay-friendly city in the Middle East and one of the leading in the world on this. When we see progress on issues that are important to progressive Jews, like the decision by the Supreme Court 2 weeks ago to recognize reform and conservative conversions to Judaism that are done in Israel. All of that progress has only been possible because of the Israeli Supreme Court. None of these things happened because there was a majority in the Knesset that decided to begin legislating pro-LGBT, feminist, a pluralistic Judaism kind of legislation. What has happened is that the Supreme Court in Israel, which has the ability to conduct judicial review, just like many Supreme Courts around the world, came and said that discrimination on the basis of sex, on the basis of sexual orientation, on the basis of religion, is against the basic laws of the State of Israel, and it's against the founding document of the State of Israel, Megillat HaAtzmaut, our Proclamation of Independence. And for the ultra-Orthodox, this is a huge problem. They see the Supreme Court as a threat to their political power like no other. Menachem Begin, the mythological leader of Likud, is responsible for the quote, Yesh Shoftim beYerushalayim. There are justices in Jerusalem, which referred to the Supreme Court. And he basically made the point that even if there is a Supreme Court decision that you don't like, that you disagree with, you have to respect the authority of the justices. And this is, at the end of the day, the final and deciding institution on issues of the rule of law. Netanyahu, for many, many years, adhered to that agenda. There are video clips. I could share them with you if we had more time, but time is always the most expensive commodity. There are videos of Netanyahu from 7 and 8 years ago where he is speaking about the Supreme Court, and he says proudly, I have defended the Supreme Court's independence from those on the right wing and the religious parties who want to weaken the Supreme Court, and I believe that the Supreme Court needs to remain strong and independent. That was his position for many years. But in the recent years, that has changed. Because of the criminal indictments that he is facing in court in Israel, he's been indicted by the Attorney General of his own government for a bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He has changed his view on the judicial system, and he now supports the ultra-Orthodox demand to allow the Knesset to overrule the Supreme Court. Why has he changed his view on this? If Netanyahu and the religious parties that support him will win 61 seats in the upcoming election, he has a plan to do two things. Number one, he wants to pass a law in the Knesset that will retroactively cancel his own indictment, basically put it out of the agenda. But he knows very well that such a law will be struck down by the Supreme Court, because it is what we call in Israel a personal law that solves the problem of one citizen and creates discrimination against all the other citizens. Why should Netanyahu be the only person in the state of Israel who can retroactively cancel an indictment against himself? The Supreme Court will absolutely strike down such a law. And that is when Netanyahu wants to pass a law in the Knesset that allows the smallest Knesset majority of 61 seats to overrule Supreme Court decisions. For him, that is a way to ensure the cancellation of the indictment. But for the ultra-Orthodox, as I said, this is a dream come true of many, many decades, because if you can cancel with the smallest possible majority a decision by the Supreme Court, a lot of the progress that we have seen in Israel and that they are so angry about, whether it's on progressive Judaism, pluralistic Judaism, women's rights, gay rights, minority rights, a lot of that can be undone. One of the reasons that the ultra-Orthodox parties are very, very concerned right now is because they are seeing that the non-Orthodox movements in Israel are growing and getting stronger. There are more and more Israelis who are expressing interest in these movements, the conservative and reform movements in Israel. More and more Israelis are choosing those movements for their expressions of Judaism. Now, I don't know how it works in Australia. I have the American Jewish example, which I know very well because I've lived several years in the United States and was very involved in the Jewish community over there. My wife worked at a conservative synagogue. In the United States, the main expression that people have for the Jewish identity and for membership in a Jewish movement is the synagogue. You go to shul on Friday evening, on Shabbat morning. In Israel, it's not like that. You don't need to be a member of a synagogue to express your Judaism in Israel. I wake up in the morning here in my kibbutz, I say Boker Tov to my neighbor, I'm living a Jewish life, okay? But when people do want to express their Judaism, it's usually around life cycle events, weddings, Brit Milah, or Tekes Simchat Bat, Bar Mitzvah, Bat Mitzvah, of course, holidays. And more Israelis, whether they consider themselves secular or Masorti, traditional, are finding the model of Judaism that is offered by the non-Orthodox movements to be more appealing than the Orthodox model they have grown accustomed to in Israel. And more people are getting married through reform and conservative weddings. My wife and I, we had our wedding here in Kibbutz Nachal Oz in 2016. It was the first wedding in this kibbutz after the terrible Gaza war of 2014. We brought 400 people to the kibbutz. In Israel, 400 is a mid-sized wedding. I just have to say it's not considered large. And we had Rabbi Meir Azari from Bet Daniel in Tel Aviv initiate the wedding. And we had some religious friends, Orthodox religious friends, who came to the wedding. And this was the first time in their life that they saw a Reform wedding. And afterwards, they came to us and they said, what's the problem with this? Why isn't this recognized by the authorities? I mean, this isn't so bad. It looks like any other wedding. And that is happening in more and more families, in more and more places in Israel. And this is why the ultra-Orthodox parties actually are very, very, feel a great urgency to try to weaken these movements. Because the growth of these movements is alarming to them. And of course, the fact that in this election there is a Reform rabbi who could become for the first time a member of Knesset, Gilad Kariv, on the labor list, great problem for them. So the stakes this time are really high because they want to crush the progress of these movements in Israel. And of course, weakening the Supreme Court is a major milestone in trying to achieve that. But the good news is that regardless of the political situation, the fact that more and more Israelis, especially young people my age, are expressing interest in the first place and are getting involved, that's organic. That doesn't come out of politics. And that is something that can create a lot of potential moving forward.
We have been truly...
Well, thank you.
Truly blessed with a deeply thoughtful and very provocative discourse. It is your funding in the past that has backed the legal process leading up to this historic Supreme Court decision. And interestingly, the legal team was headed by a former Sydney girl, Nikki Maor, who made Aliyah many years ago. And we look forward to welcoming her at the end of April for our last Progressive Appeal function for this year. It is your funding which not only assists the Israeli movement to get stronger and stronger, but helps thousands of Israelis, refugees and others to get social benefits through our movement's Keren B'Kavod social support program, to attend summer camps and become part of the fabric of Israeli society, to do a gap year program between school and the army at a progressive Mechina in Jaffa and help the local Arab community, to get legal aid for their immigration and absorption when the Orthodox-controlled Ministry of the Interior blocks their way. Nikki and her team have helped over 100,000 Olim secure their rights as Jews, and you have helped fund her work. And we fight for every woman's right to sit where they want on a bus, for every person's right to be legally married, whether gay or straight, to be divorced or buried in Israel, and to remove offensive modesty signs. And we are still fighting to enable men and women to pray together at the Kotel. Your investment in Australia has been exemplary and it can continue to do so. But this year, we have to recognise one big change. COVID-19 has hit Israelis much harder than Australians. And our movement has continued to reach out and do that which needs to be done. Please give generously when you fill out your pledge cards if you are here in person, and give them to Jocelyn or me before you leave tonight. If you are joining us on Zoom, you'll now see a link in the chat box. Please click on it to fill in your electronic pledge form, which goes directly to Jocelyn at the UPJ. Through the wonders of Zoom, we are now able to do electronically that which we can also do in person. I know how great the need is in Israel in this awful COVID-affected environment. I've actually increased my pledge this year 10%. Please join me in investing in progressive Jewish values in Israel and let your dollars help make Israel a home for all Jews.